Hey, Darrell, welcome to the show.
Hey, Amy. It's so good to see you.
It is so good to see you. For those who don't know, Darrell is probably the reason why Chasing Dreams was a podcast, or is a podcast, was a podcast, depends on when you're listening. But yeah, you helped me with my intro, my outro, getting equipment. Do you remember all that?
I do. Yeah. That was but listen, you were doing your thing before I came into the picture.
I was trying with my little old podcast about a TV show, and you were doing some big stuff. Just not just with audio editing, but you have a production essentially. How would you describe Golden Spiral Media?
Golden Spiral Media is a podcast network
Hmm.
of geeky sci-fi genre stuff. So if we don't do a whole lot of horror anymore. We used to have a horror themed podcast, but we'll still touch on that from time to time. But it's mostly sci-fi, comic book, that type of stuff, TV and film projects. Yeah.
So before we get into GSM, how did you even get into podcasting?
Hmm.
I don't think I know that
So
story.
Well, what happened was I still to this day don't watch a lot of TV, which is surprising to some people because I run a
Right.
podcast network about TV shows, but I really don't watch a lot of TV. And this was back in 2004, and my wife and I were in the living room watching TV one night, and this commercial came on, and this I thought that show looks interesting. I think we'll watch that. What days it come on? We made a note, well, let's watch it. We didn't have a DVR or those days. If we wanted to watch a show, you watched it live or you pulled out the VCR. This is in 2004, even though DVRs existed. And that show was Lost. And man, oh man, fell in love with that show like I have never fallen in love with a show. And I was getting on forums and chat rooms online and just trying to connect with the fandom as much as I could, discussing the show, and I was really into it. And then in 2006, so this would have been season 3 of the show. I guess maybe it was in during season 2, but somebody in one of those forums mentioned there were podcasts about the show. And I thought, well, that sounds cool. I've never listened to a podcast before. I'm not even sure if I had heard the word podcast. I'm not sure. I might have, but that was definitely in 2006. And so I went to iTunes, started searching for podcasts, and I found several, probably four, five, six about Lost. And I listened to all of them. There was the official Lost podcast that the producers were doing. There was Jay and Jack's Lost podcast. My two favorites were the transmission by Ryan and Jen Ozawa, and the weekly Lost podcast with Cliff and Stephanie Ravenscraft. And I just loved those. And then Lost is what turned me on to J.J. Abrams. I was not familiar with J.J. Abrams prior to that. And so in 2008, it was, I don't know if it was during the Super Bowl or sometime, seems like it was during some sort of spring, might have been during the Olympics or something. Something was happening in the spring. It was a biggish TV event, and they threw out a trailer for this new show called Fringe, and it was the new J.J. Abrams project. And I came into work the next day, and a buddy of mine said, "Man, did you see that trailer for Fringe?" And we were like, "Yeah," because we would talk about Lost every week. We were all big Lost fans then. And I don't think it was that day. It was a couple of days later, I think. He said, "You know what? We should start a podcast about Fringe." And I thought that was a great idea.
And
So,
this was
so that's
before
what
it
we
even
did.
came out?
Yeah, yeah. That was in probably February or March, and it premiered September later. So it was a good 6 months, but we
Hmm.
launched the podcast. I think we launched it in July, and I was brand new at hosting a website and stuff, and my website crashed and I lost a bunch of stuff, and so we had to reboot everything. And so I think now, if you look at when our first episode, it was around August 5th, 1st, something around there. So we launched the podcast late July, early August of 2008, and then the show premiered in September of 2008.
That's crazy. So I had a similar journey with my first podcast in that I had got hooked to a TV show, was searching forums and stuff like that. That time I was on the fringe of, no pun intended, of knowing what podcasts were, and saw all these shows about TV shows that people like, but there was none about the show I liked. Hence, I started my own. But
Nice.
Fringe isn't the only podcast that you made about a TV show, though. Like, that was probably the domino.
Oh, yes.
Like, how is that the domino? How many TV shows have you done a podcast about? You yourself?
Myself. So I've done a couple on a different network. There was a different network called TV Talk, and that was going simultaneous to Golden Spiral Media. But Golden Spiral Media podcasts are an hour and a half long. They're deep dives. And TV Talk, those episodes were like 10 minutes. So there was not really a conflict of interest. So I hosted a Doctor Who and Person of Interest and Falling Skies on that network, on the TV Talk network. I think those were the only ones I did on TV Talk. And then I pulled up the list here because I won't remember otherwise. For Golden Spiral Media, I'm currently doing Debris. We have a podcast called Debris Division, and Stranger Things called the Stranger Things podcast, and Twilight Zone called Entering the Fifth Dimension. So those are my 3 active that are about TV shows. We have one called Mouse House Weekly. We cover some Disney Plus stuff there, but it's not exclusively Disney Disney Plus. And then in the past, I've done Almost Human. We moved that Falling Skies over to GSM when that other network shut down and made it a full deep dive podcast. We called that Berserker Cast. Let's see. I'm just scrolling down here, looking at all the lists. The Fringe podcast, of course. Grace Point, we covered that. Person of Interest, we also moved that. Same story as.
That was a fun show.
So good. Ahead of its time in so many ways. Let's see. Revolution, that was an NBC show we did.
One season, right? That one ended up being one season.
2 seasons.
2 seasons, yeah.
2 seasons, yeah. Triple Cast, which covered 3 movies that have something in common. Could be the same director, could be the same author that wrote the source material, same composer, something like that. Maybe they're all 3 time travel. That was a fun one. We have to go back. My wife and I did that when we went back. We went to Hawaii for a reunion event. So we covered the whole series on that. That was a lost podcast. X-Files, we still believe, is what we called that. So I don't know how many that is, but those are the ones I've done that are TV or film related.
That's wild. And that's just you, right? I mean, you have other people who have shows on the network. So
that's right. Yes.
Rough estimate on how many are active today on GSM?
Oh, that are active today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7.
That's
8. Sorry, I missed one. 8.
That's still impressive. I think so many times when we talk about podcasts, people talk about not TV entertainment. It's often focused on finance. It's focused on business. It's focused on everything but the other smaller areas of podcasting that I think people forget. Hey, there are podcasts about TV shows and movies, guys.
That's right. They're often overlooked. In fact, we've had meetups when we go to. I remember having a meetup at New Media Expo in like 2013, and it was a TV and film podcasters meetup, and we had it at the buffet at the Rio, and there was about 15 or so, maybe 20 of us that showed up, and
that's awesome.
It was great. I mean, I sat down across from a couple of guys, and I'm like, yeah, what's your podcast? And it was this Star Trek podcast that I loved. And I'm like, you're those guys. I mean, we were all just nerding out over each other. It was so much fun. Yeah. It's a great little part to be, great group of podcasters. We're so supportive. There's no competition really. I mean, there's some competition sometimes if you're podcasting about your TV show and there's another podcast about the same TV show. But even then, I've seen a lot of collaboration and support across the aisle, if you will. So it's a great community to be a part of.
What would you think people would be surprised to learn about TV and movie podcasts? I'm just going to call them entertainment podcasts because it could be about books or, art, whatever. But entertainment podcasts, what would one thing, something people would be surprised about?
They can be as or more life-changing than your business podcast or your finance podcast or your inspirational podcast or whatever it is that you consider or you think of? If I said, give me a genre that can change your life, a
Mm-hmm.
podcast genre that can change your life, these can do that. And I'll give you a quick story. When we did Fringe, we really hit lightning in a bottle with that podcast, but we did that podcast for all 5 seasons that Fringe aired. It had 100 episodes. The show did. We usually did 2 episodes, 2 podcast episodes for every single
Episode?
TV episode. Yeah.
Wow.
So we had well over, and we had a lot of bonus episodes. We had well over 300 episodes of our podcast. And I don't want to give too much away on Fringe, even though I feel like we're probably beyond the spoiler zone, but maybe someone's listening and goes, I'll go check out Fringe. The show did something with a couple and their child, and their child died. And it was tragic and it was very, very sad. And we had someone in our community who had their child die.
Oh, wow.
And I used to not be able to tell the story at all without just breaking down. I'm better, but I'm still. And she wrote into our podcast near the end of the show, and she told us a story of how the TV show, first and foremost, let's be clear about that, but also our podcast and the community that had formed around our podcast had helped her come to a place of healing with that death that she didn't think she didn't think it was possible. She didn't think she'd ever get to that point of healing. And so that came through the TV show and the vehicle of our podcast. The community came around the podcast. When the show wrapped up, we had a party here in Oklahoma City where I live. She came to it. She was one of the attendees, and I've met her a couple of times since. She lives in Atlanta, and anytime I'm in Atlanta, I try to meet up with her. But she's an example of how someone's life can be transformed in a way that you would never think possible. I certainly never thought that. When I started a podcast about the TV show, I thought, I want to geek out with some friends, have some fun. Maybe somebody will listen.
I don't think we
if you'd have told me, I would have. What's that?
I don't think we realized the power of it.
Right. I never would have thought that something like that could happen, and I would make lifelong friends through a podcast. It's been amazing.
And you've actually pivoted from doing this, having impacts. You're still doing it, having impacts in this genre and what you're doing, but you've also pivoted slightly to now helping others, serving others in this capacity of making their own podcasts. And so what has that been like, kind of putting the shoe on the other foot, so to speak?
It's been wild. Before that, I had a corporate job, pretty good job. I worked at the corporate office of this chain of bookstores. I was the director of the e-commerce division. I helped start that division and build the website from the ground up and all the logistics and stuff that went with it. Had a great team. I mentioned the podcast, the Fringe podcast. I did that with 2 of my coworkers there.
Wow.
It's at a really good place to work. There's bad apples at every job, and a couple of those really made it hard for me to stay there. And so I was looking for a place to get out. And podcasting was not obvious to me at first. I was just, I don't know. It should have been my obvious first choice. But at some point I did get the realization that I could do podcast editing for other people. There was a need for that. And so, yeah, that TV Talk actually was my first client. I was not only a host on their network, but I did all the production for all those episodes. And so I would work until like 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes, usually about 2 in the morning, and then go to bed for a few hours and then get up and do my corporate job. And I did that for 6 months until I'd finally saved up enough money to turn in my notice and leave the corporate job. And it's been a wild trip. After TV Talk went out of business, or ceased operations, however you want to phrase that, I lost a big chunk of my income. We lived out of our savings account for like 6 months until we were not going to have enough money to pay for our bills the next month. And new clients were not coming in. We'd gone 5 months without landing a single new client. and that's when we rebranded. I was trying to do everything under Golden Spiral Media, which is a brand focused on creating our own content about sci-fi stuff.
Right.
And finally, a lead came and she said, "I'm confused when I go to your website. I see a bunch of sci-fi stuff. I need someone who's serious about editing podcasts for other people." And I'm like, "I'm serious. That's how I feed my family." And but that showed me, because I had pondered earlier, do I build a standalone brand new
Right.
brand, or do I build off the existing brand? And so that was like, oh, okay, I do need to build a clear, distinct standalone brand. And that was a difference maker. We've seen steady growth every month since then, since we launched that brand in October of 2014. But it's been a wild ride. It's been so much fun to kind of get on the other side of the microphone and help people develop their podcast, edit their podcast, and get their content out, and help them in whatever way we can.
And Darrell and his team are fantastic guys. He's taking care of my podcast for years, and I loved working with him for it. And I gotta say,
Thank you.
Darrell, you've done it. You've helped so many people with their podcast. You've probably experienced a number of lessons learned for podcasters. What is one or two lessons that you think people who are thinking about going to podcasting should keep in mind?
Oh, well, there's a few. I mean, if you're starting out,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you have the luxury anymore of not paying attention to your sound. Content is still very, very important,
Mm-hmm.
but so is your sound. And it's so easy nowadays. It's kind of funny. I've got a YouTube video about a new device. In fact, I'm using it right now. It's the Zoom PodTrack P4.
Mm-hmm.
And it does in a little small footprint what, when I started out in 2008, would have taken cables going everywhere. And like, if you wanted to bring in a phone call,
Yeah.
you had to have a thing called a phone bridge that by itself was $500, not to mention the all the other gear. It would have been $1,000 to $1,500, and this thing is $200, not including a microphone and stuff. So you're all in for about $300, and it's just incredible. And I mentioned that in this video, and this I got a negative comment on it, and it says, because I mentioned I've been podcasting since 2008, I guess he was put off by that and turned the video off. I thought that was bizarre. But back in those days, like, you could get away with sounding mediocre. If you sounded good, you were the standout, which is something we tried to do. It took us a while to get there.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays it's so easy. You can get a great sounding mic for $100 if you just by yourself record into your computer, get a USB microphone, not the Yeti, get like an ATR 2100 or a Samson Q2U, and you'll sound really, really good for $100. And so there's no reason not to. That's a pretty low barrier to get across. Like I said, back in my day, I sound like a get off my lawn guy, but you were going to spend several $100s to over $1,000 to sound good in those days.
You remember helping me. I had a mixer, I had a gate, I had the headphone amp, right? And I had a rack for those three things. And it was like, gear. I was geared up. And everybody was impressed by the sound, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone, I always got compliments on my sound. That's not something I've ever struggled with for my podcast after I got help. Right? But before that, now I got a Rodecaster Pro that, like you said, has the smallest footprint. It's on my desk, connected to my laptop. The end.
Yeah, it's so good. You had the same setup that I did. I still have that. I've got it kind of tucked over in the corner, and that rack and that same mixer, the Soundcraft mixer, and
it's still good.
It's still good, but it takes up a lot of space, and the technology's come along. So I would say invest in a good microphone. It doesn't have to be good. Does not mean expensive. It can be. I think there are advantages to getting more expensive microphones. That doesn't mean the most expensive microphone is that much better. There's kind of a diminishing returns type of thing going on there, but I would say invest in equipment. But the other thing is, there's two other things I'd say is, one is really know who your audience is. It's easy when you're doing a TV show. Let's be frank. It's easy. I am talking to fans
Yeah,
of
there you
debris,
go. That is
right?
that it is.
But you need to really think about who you're talking to and narrow it down as much as possible. And you hear this said by many people, but it's true. I'm currently reading John Lee Dumas's new book that he just released. It's The Common Path to Uncommon Success. Here it is. And that's, get it in the camera there. And that's one of the things that he covers in there. It's so 101, but if you can't skip it. And a lot of people think, well, I want the biggest audience possible. I want to speak to small business owners. No, you don't. That's not good enough. Small business owners who are under 35 years of age, you're getting closer. Who are female, you're getting closer. Who are not college educated. Okay, now we're getting there. Who had their first business fail and don't want to see their second one fail. Okay, all right, now we're getting there. Because now you're really going to be able to speak to where they're at. And they're going to be really energized about your content, tell their friends about it who are like them and so forth. So, broader paintbrushes are not the answer when it comes to this type of content. And they're going to help you stand out. There's a lot of business podcasts out there, right? What makes you unique? And so you've got to really niche down to figure that out. And the third thing I would say is be prepared for the grind. Podcasting is a grind. You need to, before you launch, you should have 20, 30, 40, 50 episodes outlined, sketched out, figured out what the topic is going to be. Because you're going to, and that may seem like a lot, but it's not. It's not. I've been there. I remember starting a podcast and I had 50 ideas. And I'm like, I'm set because now I can just build off this. I'll just keep rolling in new ideas.
Yep.
And the day came where I was like, I got 5 things left on my list and these 5 don't sound as good as they did when I wrote them down. Like, what was I thinking when I wrote those down? And it's going to become a grind at some point, and you've got to be prepared for that mentally. That's why Pro Podcast Solutions does what we do to help kind of alleviate that burden from people. But it's going to be a grind, either creating the content or editing the content or writing the content, whatever it is. You've got little birds to feed with content each week or however often you're doing episodes, and you can't let them go hungry.
It's almost like everything you say is the recipe to avoid podfade. It's what you do to keep going. It's how you survive the grind, because it can be a grind. There are going to be days where if people tell you, podcasting, if you're supposed to love it, you're supposed to enjoy it. It's that thing you do. Yeah, but it's still work.
Yeah.
It's still work. I mean,
it's still work. I love doing, currently I'm doing a podcast about debris and called Debris Division, and I love it. I spend a lot of hours each week doing it. When I was doing Fringe, I wasn't as efficient as I am now. And we did a few things that we don't do currently with debris, but I was spending 13 hours a week on that, between 13 and 16 hours a week on that podcast. It's a lot. And I had a full-time job on top of that, right? So it can be a lot. Right now with debris, I spend probably 8 to 10 hours, depending on the week. Depending on if we're interviewing someone from the show or not, then that's going to increase my workload by several hours. But it's a lot of work.
But that's something you're choosing to do, right? I mean,
yeah, of course.
That's the thing. I think one reasons that Ant and I start this podcast, YouTube video, wherever you're watching this, is we want you guys to have all the answers up, at least be informed up front. We're not going to get you all the answers, but we're bringing in people who have been there, done that. And, Haven, my first podcast was a labor of love, but I was up like Darrell, 2, 3, 4 hours after the show ended, writing up show notes. And that's one of the reasons I hate writing show notes. And one of the first things I did was outsource show notes when I started my second podcast. I was like, I will edit myself, but just show notes. Somebody do the show notes. And it was the best decision for me. But it was a labor of love that you did because you wanted to do it. You loved what you were doing and the impact it had. But, podcasting is still work. Enjoyable work, but still work. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, work doesn't mean that it's you hate it. I mean, there are times where I'm tired and I want to go to bed and I've got to finish an edit or I've got to do some sort of preparation. So there are those times, but it is still something that I very much enjoy.
Where do you see podcasting going, Darrell? I mean, you've kind of you've been in the game for a bit. You've seen the new players that are coming up, especially for TV, movie, and entertainment podcasts. What do you think the future looks like for them?
I'm not quite sure. I think about this from time to time, and I don't have an answer. I
Mm-hmm.
don't. My crystal ball is pretty foggy. I mean, there are always interesting things happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Apple just announced from when we were recording this, like a week ago, week and a half ago, they announced their new paid platform so
Subscribers.
podcasters
Yeah.
can monetize. Yeah, which has been a bit of a disaster for them rolling that out so far, but they'll get that all worked out. And so I think that's going to help some people make some money on their podcast where they've found difficulty doing that before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's I think really I'm really excited about that. I think that's going to give particularly the independent podcaster a lot more ability to monetize than they might have had before. Not to say they couldn't before. I think Patreon's a great example of how a platform people have tapped into in the past and monetized. That's going to have some similarities to what Apple is doing. It's just Apple ecosystem and their platform is going to make it a little bit easier, I think. But so I see things like that. Spotify's getting bigger
Mm-hmm.
into the podcasting realm, and there are others who are trying to be the next Spotify, the next Apple, or what Spotify did last year has really pushed Apple to. Apple used to be kind of complacent. They were
Yes.
the big market share leader, and they built a lot of great infrastructure to
Yeah.
support podcasts and then kind of rested on their laurels. And then over the last 5 years, a lot of other players have come in and really shaken up the space. And I think from a hosting platform, Libsyn is kind of guilty of that too. And a lot of people like,
Mm-hmm.
Buzzsprout is a great example. They've come in and added new features. Anchor did some things, and now you've seen a lot of movement out of Libsyn this
Mm-hmm.
year to change their platform,
Yeah.
to buying and acquiring other companies to be able to round out their suite of services. So it's exciting from that point of view. I feel like everyone's getting on the podcasting in the game. I won't call it the bandwagon because that makes it sound like it's something
Yeah.
that's going to end. And I do see a lot of people go, but yeah, there's so many podcasts now. And sure, there's more competition than ever before. There's over 2 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts, but not all of those are active. Many of them are dormant. I don't have that number handy. But there's still far fewer rather podcasts than blogs or
Yes.
YouTube channels. And so there's still a tremendous amount of opportunity out there. And so I see it growing exponentially for the foreseeable future.
Guys, there's space for you. If you have a voice, if you have a message, share it. That's the thing we
Yeah.
want you to do. And that's why people like Darrell do the work that they do. They want to help you. Uh, they're here for that. And so you'll find all of Darrell's information, Pro Podcast Solutions, even links to Golden Spiral Media, so you can check out his podcast in the description in the show notes. Before I let you go, Darrell, I just want to remind you guys, Darrell talked about equipment. And one of the things we put together is this starter equipment for you guys so that you can put that there. Find some simple equipment that you can use, not the Yeti, but that you can also use so that you have quality sound. So be sure to check it out, aimeej21.com/begin to podcast. You can get it there. Darrell, my friend, I am so glad we could connect. It's a bummer that podcast movement and all those conferences that we would see each other at have been sidelined because of the pandemic, but at least we got to connect virtually here.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. I've missed seeing your beautiful face, and it's just always fun talking with you. Thank you for having me on this.
Guys, Darrell's not just somebody who's helped me with my podcast, but he's become a good friend. And that's one of the reasons why podcasting is so amazing. You never know the connections you'll make.
That's right.